This is a video about Drew Hayden Taylor's short piece called Summer of Our Discontent Revisited. Drew Hayden Taylor is primarily a playwright, but he's written a lot of journalistic pieces too for various Indigenous publications, kind of newsy pieces about current events, and this is one of them. It's from a collection called Funny You Don't Look Like One. And the joke in the title there is that Drew Hayden Taylor is from mixed ancestry. He's white and Indigenous. And so the subtitle of this piece is Reflections, I think, from a Blue-Eyed Ojibwe. So he's Indigenous, but he has blue eyes from his white genetics. And so that's why people say, funny, you don't look like one. You know, you don't look like a native, you don't look like an Indigenous person. And so there's all sorts of questions that he often addresses around passing, passing for white and so forth. But anyway, I'll just point out a few things in this piece, and it's just to sort of talk about examples and representation of Indigenous people and the kinds of issues that circulate and the ways in which we receive them through narratives, through story, through newspapers, and so forth. Now, the title of this piece, Summer of Our Discontent Revisited, he's actually taking a line, the opening line, I believe it's from Richard III in Shakespeare, that he begins, "Now is the winter of our discontent," and he continues on in this play. And so he's talking about the summer of our discontent, and what he's referring to is the situation in 1995 in Ipperwash, and he only mentions it in passing, okay? Excuse me, this is the sort of point I want to make about Indigenous literature and how it gets read and so forth. Sorry, my computer is giving me grief here. And so he begins, "It seems that opinions about the treatment of the all too frequent Native crisis are being voiced more openly. Or more accurately, there appears to be a double standard in relation to blockades, a belief that perhaps natives are getting preferential treatment and getting handled with kid gloves." Kid gloves just means nicely, as if you're gentle. "Tell that to Dudley George, the Ojibwe man killed at Ipperwash." That's all he mentions, right, of Dudley George for the most part. And so you might ask, who's Dudley George? And that would be a very good question to ask. And if you pay attention to media, I'm recording this in 2020, CBC, just recently had a 25-year retrospective on Ipperwash. Did anybody notice it? Did anybody pay attention? I don't know. Depends on who you are and whether you watch CBC or whatever, right? But he just leaves it at that, okay? It's a kind of fact. Tell that to Dudley George. What happened? Well, you can read about this easily, just search up Ipperwash and Dudley George on the internet and you'll get all sorts of documentaries and information, and you can read about the discussion there. But Ipperwash, just really quickly, was land that was expropriated by the Canadian government from the Ojibwe people during the Second World War. And they said, we need to build a military camp here for war purposes, so we're going to take your land. Don't worry, we'll give it back. I think they had heard that one before somewhere. And so they never really gave it back. The government said, oh, yeah, we'll get around to it. And so in 95, 50 years after the end of the war, they started protesting and demonstrating, saying, can we have our land back, please? They asked nicely, and no, blah, blah, blah. And so there was a blockade. And events are murky. There's competing stories and so forth. But at the end of the day, what happened was Dudley George was shot and died on his way to hospital. And people saw this as excessive violence. And again, here we are in 2020, 25 years after Ipperwash, and we're watching with horror in the United States where, black people are still being killed by police and the police are not being, given any kind of consequences for that action. And just, a couple days ago in Canada, we heard a story of an Indigenous woman being admitted to hospital, and she was recording things on her cell phone as she died, and she recorded a bunch of, racial slurs against her from the nurses as she was dying on the table. And, this is the kind of thing that Drew Hayden Taylor is writing about. Whether it's Dudley George, whether it's George Floyd in the United States, whether it's this Indigenous woman who dies in hospital, the examples are just numerous. They're everywhere. And this is, what Hayden Taylor is asking us to think about when reading this piece. So he's making all these references just really quickly to all sorts of things that indicate much larger problems. And so, I'm teaching this alongside Thomas King and Marilyn Dumont, and it's like, we see that there's a pretty consistent thematic in some, certainly not all, but certainly much of Indigenous literature, that we want to, pay attention to these examples. And so he's drawing attention to this double standard and saying, white people, he's generalizing here, saying white people think that natives are getting treated with kid gloves. And he said, wouldn't that be nice? Equal rights, what a concept. As if the white people, think that natives should be treated just like other people, that they're somehow being treated with kid gloves. And Drew Hayden Taylor is saying, no, actually, if you look at the history, Dudley George has been murdered, and all these other people have been murdered. We just have to look at, the recent discussions around the movement for the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, okay, that they, are murdered much in greater proportion than, say, white women and girls, especially those who work in prostitution in urban centers and so forth, okay? So there are all sorts of indicators that, as it points out in this short news piece, that the natives get the short end of the stick, okay? And so he draws attention to, statistics and says, how is it that Aboriginals make up 5% of the population, yet the incarceration rates are as high as 40%? And he just does the math with this. He's like, look, if you look in history, Indigenous people pre-contact had no use for jails. There was no real significant crime to speak of. Did people do bad things? Absolutely. Did we have jails and need to, put people? No, there was none of that. So how is it that all of a sudden, within a few generations, that they're overcrowding jails? And, when we hear this discussion, in the media now about systemic racism, I mean, this is what Drew Hayden Taylor is talking about. And he publishes this piece in 1998. Like, these are not new ideas. It's not like suddenly people have said, systemic racism, maybe that's a thing. People who suffer at the hands of these systems have been talking about this for centuries. Okay, this goes back to slave trade coming out of Africa in the 17th and 18th century. Okay, these arguments have always been made. It's a question of how we listen to them. And so that's the thing, this was one of the interesting things about this. And he's like, tell that to Dudley George. Well, you can't, because he's dead. And so he talks about this, about the 60s scoop up. It's partly a cultural problem, right? That the cultures can't talk to each other very well. And he's saying, in the 60s, okay, so many of you probably learned about residential schools in high school and whatnot, but you probably didn't learn about the 60s scoop. Maybe you did. I don't know what they teach to different classes in different places, but the 60s scoop up, for example, was essentially forced adoption. What happened, and we'll read more about this later on in the course, is that social workers would come into the families of Indigenous people and say, you know what, you're too poor to take care of your kids, so we're going to adopt your children out to other more appropriate families. And they would forcibly remove these children from their biological Indigenous parents and place them with usually white families. And often these white families were not necessarily better off financially or even as families than the families that they were taken from. But it was this belief that a nuclear family that could provide for these children was better. That's why he makes the distinction between the nuclear family and the extended family. He says there's cultural difference here, that it wouldn't be a weird thing in Indigenous society to be raised by your aunt or your second cousin or your grandparents. It was a much more open, non-nuclear family, much more dispersed and distributive notion of childcare. Yet, policy dictated that this was what would happen. And so these children, through the 60s and into the 70s and beyond, were forcibly adopted into other families. And some of them were actually shipped overseas. Some went to Germany, some went to Australia. And they kept very poor records in many cases, that people in the world don't even know who their biological parents are. And they have no home to return to because they don't know where they came from, and so on and so forth. And he's saying, he's like, what do you think the cultural damage is here? What do you think the trauma is on a group of people that this has happened to? He's like, it's not surprising that we see these kinds of demonstrations. And this is me editorializing. Perhaps, if anything, they're quite sedate or understated given the severity of the problem. And so he ends off with this this reference to Hugh MacLennan. He says Hugh MacLennan was incredibly naive when he wrote his book Two Solitudes. He couldn't even begin to understand how many solitudes there really are. And what he's doing there is coming back to the literary references to Hugh MacLennan, and he's a Canadian writer, and he wrote a novel about the French-English divide in Canada. And he's like, that's all well and good if you're white and you're coming from colonial stock. Maybe that French-English divide means something to you. But there's way more divides than just those two. There's the Aboriginal divide, the Indigenous divide, of course, but even within that, there's a whole bunch of individual groupings within that suggest other necessities for addressing these historical wrongs.